I have been called many things by my good friends from the press and media. The Times called me a simple-minded fool. Maybe they're right. For if it's simple-minded to believe that people, all people, are entitled to food, to warmth and shelter, to a good education, a free health service, and a well-paid job, then yes, I am simple-minded. If it's foolish to want to spend money on milk for children and care for elderly, rather than on even more sophisticated bombs for military, then I am a fool.
Made in 1988, A Very British Coup is a political fantasy from a time when a Labour government seemed inconceivable.
A Very British Coup is about the election of a left-wing Labour government led by a rather charismatic Sheffield steelworker that threatens to remove the American bases from the UK, which naturally upsets the Americans.
I'm authorized to warn you. If you jeopardize the Western alliance, my government will be forced to regard that as a hostile act.
It's not long before the dark forces of the establishment, together with the Americans, are plotting the downfall of the socialist Prime Minister.
It's a very British coup because there are no firing squads, there are no tanks in the street, and yet by manipulating the old boy network and the Secret Service and so on, he can be unseated.
And good evening from Redline TV. It's Monday, so that's what we're doing. And tonight, I think we've got a really, really interesting program. Now, what we're not going to be doing is looking back to see what Corbyn might have done had he got in. What we're going to be doing, and I think it's particularly relevant at the moment, is having a look at what he might have faced had he got in, and is there any way around it? Now, Chris Mullin has been a journalist, a writer, and an MP. He was Minister in the Department for the Environment, Transport and the Regions, in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and in the Department for International Development. He did a campaign for the release of the Birmingham Six, the victims of a huge miscarriage of justice. He's written 4 books, but amongst them is A Very British Coup, written, published 1982, which was later adapted very successfully for television. Chris Mullin has also been a supporter of Tony Benn and edited 2 collections of Tony Benn's speeches and writings. He was also the editor of Tribune between 1982 and 1984. So after a week of huge political turbulence with a successful coup against Truss and the role of the markets being the focus of so much political and economic storms, many of us have become extremely aware that Corbyn or any other leader of the left, had they got in, if they were to get in, would be faced with similar or worse. So we're very happy tonight to have Chris here to talk about what is actually, I think, still, I say still because I read it many years ago and have reread it just now, but it remains a really fine, remarkable work of apparent fiction, A Very British Coup. Now, the Daily Telegraph called A Very British Coup preposterous. Now, I suspect, having gone through both the Corbyn leadership years and the last few weeks of a Truss premiership and what's happened, they would be pretty hard pressed to use that kind of description again. Chris, good evening. Lovely to have you here.
Hi. I published 9 books, by the way, not 4.
Oh my goodness!
Three volumes of diaries.
Oh yes, the volumes of diaries.
Amongst other things, yeah. But don't worry about it. It's all right.
A great book, and I really recommend anybody who hasn't read it to read it. It's because it's not just a good read; it's a fascinating read. in terms of what has happened in the last few years of British politics. So just to start with my first question, which was really, why did you write it? What actually made you write it?
Well, it was written in 1981, which was also quite a fraught year for the Labour Party. And when it was thought there was a possibility that Tony Benn would become leader. And the establishment was getting rather upset at that prospect. And I was on a train coming from the Labour Party conference that year, might have been 1980 actually, and I was with Peter Hain, Tony Banks and Stuart Holland. The other two subsequently became, well, three of us subsequently became MPs, and Stuart Holland was already an MP. And one of our numbers said, I wonder what would happen if Tony Benn were to become Prime Minister. And another of our numbers said, oh, that would make a good novel. And whereupon Stuart Holland revealed that by the swimming pool in Greece the previous summer, he tapped out 4 chapters of a novel along exactly those lines. And then Peter Hain said, well, he and a friend had just circulated a plan for a novel along those lines to publishers. So I thought, blimey, I'd better get on with this.
Well, I think it's remarkable. And I know it's a work of fiction, but I have to say, I mean, some of the storylines and some of the concerns of it make it seem extraordinarily prophetic. Now, I'm presuming that you used a lot of your sort of insider knowledge as an MP for this. So, I mean, my next question really is bringing it up much more to the present day. When you saw Corbyn and his election and then what happened subsequently, what were your thoughts in terms of what you saw going on?
Well, things have changed a bit since then. One of the reasons, incidentally, that the book endured is because, well, firstly, some of the things in it had already happened. There had, in the 1970s, there had been military men raising private armies and all sorts of paranoia around. Anonymous article in the Times by an army officer, I remember, talking about if a Benn government came to power, what would have to be done. And then, of course, the other reason it endured is because a number of the things that in the novel were only speculation subsequently turned out to be to come to pass. So, for example, I had a MI5 agent on the Council of Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and that turned out to be a chap called Harry Newton, who'd been there for years, reporting back to headquarters. And then, of course, Peter Wright wrote his memoir just a couple of years before it was made into a film, a television series, before the novel was made into a television series. And in which he talked about bugging and burgling his way across London. And well, there were various other incidents too that that actually happened subsequently. So that gave it a certain credibility. I think the 1980s was very different, incidentally, in many respects. First of all, Benn was a far more formidable figure than Corbyn, because unlike Corbyn, he was of the establishment. Although the argument could be deployed against Corbyn that he had no experience of government whatever, and that actually is a relevant consideration, that could not be said of Benn. He'd been in government for 12 years and in the cabinet for most of that time. And so I think they were much more frightened of Benn than they were of Corbyn.
But we still saw the smears against Benn, didn't we? We saw him, wasn't there some smear about him being mad, or certainly about being a communist?
Well, the suggestion that he was mad was regularly deployed. But that, I'm afraid, is par for the course. I think we on the left occasionally do it against, occasionally say things like that. Not I, you understand, but I have heard people suggesting some members of the recent administration were intellectually challenged.
Yes. But in the book, you have, representatives of, all sorts of kind of areas of the establishment and the labour movement taking part really in the bringing down of Perkins, the left-wing prime minister. You have the trades union bureaucrat, you have the interference of the army, the establishment, you have the media, and you had a number of other players in it. You very rarely, I noticed in the book, used the term conspiracy. In fact, when you used the term, you used it very delicately. I'm quite interested in that, really, because I think this has been a term that people have found like a hot potato to use with Corbyn. How do you see what happened with Corbyn?
Well, I think there were two sets of problems. Much of the shite, if I may use that expression, that came down upon his head was predictable. It came from the media, and the usual suspects behaved in the usual way. The Mail, the Express, the Telegraph, the Times. It was a bit, and I'm afraid once he ran into problems with alleged and grossly exaggerated anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, then they all piled in. And nobody at all stuck up for him, really. That was the toxic thing, I think. It got totally out of proportion. I think we had the full gamut, actually, didn't we? We had him meeting a Czech spy who turned out to be some oddball. The damaging one. Do you remember the one about the Daily Mail devoted 12 pages to this? He was alleged to have laid a wreath on the grave of one of the perpetrators of the Munich massacre. Turned out, of course, fairly quickly that there were no perpetrators of the Munich massacre buried in that graveyard, but somebody who might have been involved with planning it was there. Since all the gravestones were in Arabic, I doubt whether Jeremy could have read any of them. And in any case, what they were commemorating, of course, he was at some pro-Palestine conference, and what they were commemorating was the bombing by the Israelis of the PLO headquarters in Tunis, which killed about 60 people, half of them Tunisians, an act of terrorism that even Mrs. Thatcher condemned at the time. But that's not how it was portrayed at all.
And it's made no difference. I mean, it was only this week I saw a newspaper comment about anti-Semitism and Jeremy Corbyn, where they used that as the example. And what seems to happen is that it needed very little evidence. It didn't need legs. It just needed to be, if you like, repeated again and again. Another big difference I found in, your storyline and what happened with Corbyn is the behaviour of the Parliamentary Labour Party in terms of Corbyn. You didn't figure that into A Very British Coup. Is that because at that point you couldn't see it happen? You couldn't imagine it?
Well, I think it is in A Very British Coup, isn't it? Albeit in a different way. Yeah. Lawrence Wainwright becomes Prime Minister in the end. He's the Chancellor and he's been plotting against Harry Perkins. He becomes Prime Minister in the end, and I think I say something like, it's many years since I read it actually, something like that it's up to the king to choose. And yes, there was a king in A Very British Coup, but I was out by about 30 years there. It's up to the king to choose who could form a government, and whether that person can form a government depends how much support he's got in the Parliamentary Labour Party. Well, of course, Lawrence Wainwright, certainly by the end, had the support in the Parliamentary Labour Party. So I think that was there to some extent. The great weakness of Jeremy, and I didn't vote for Corbyn in the leadership election, and I always knew it was going to end badly. Because in a parliamentary democracy, and as Liz Truss has just found out, But more so with Jeremy, he only had the support of about 15 or at the most 20% of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and you can't govern in those circumstances. And he would rapidly have found that that was the case. In fact, he struggled even to mount an opposition. Do you remember all the people who kept misbehaving? I'm not justifying any of this. Some of his parliamentary colleagues behaved atrociously, I recall. But that, in my view, was a fatal flaw.
So what hope for a left leader within the Labour Party? I mean, many people are sort of at the point of despair for that. Is there any hope that we can see a left leadership in the Labour Party? In
the current climate, I think there'd be general support for just a little basic social justice. Nobody's looking for a revolution at the moment. Well, it's possible that our subscribers here are, but we are a small elite. And we should not imagine that we're the majority. You can't form a government without taking at least the centre ground of British politics with you. The big lesson of the Blair years. I went to speak at Harrow once to the sixth form there, and of course the masters were all right, actually. None of them had voted. I was astonished to discover that none of them had voted, none of the ones I had tea with afterwards, had voted Conservative in the 1997 election. And one of them said to me, we think you'll win by an even bigger margin next time. And I was astonished to hear that. And I said, whatever makes you think that? He said, because we talked to the parents and they're no longer afraid of you. And that I thought, that was a strike by Blair deep behind enemy lines. Yes, but then it's what he did with it. Graham, I think you're even quoted in one of Chris's books, aren't you, or spoken about? I just said he was a delightful old headbang or something like that.
Yeah, but then you distorted things, Chris, and said I hadn't changed my mind in 30 years. I haven't changed my mind in 50 years, just for the record. But there's I've reread the book, Chris, and it's so many real insights in this. I'm just reading Harry Perkins' acceptance speech. I can quote you, I'm sure you know it, but and he says, what we have won tonight is political power. By itself, that is not enough. Real power in this country resides not in Parliament, but in the boardrooms of the City of London, in the darkest recesses of the Whitehall bureaucracy, and in the editorial offices of our national newspapers. To win real power, we first have to break the stranglehold exerted by the ruling class on all the important institutions of our country. I loved that. It almost reduced me to tears, but it also showed me the similarities between what we've witnessed with Jeremy, but also some real differences, because Harry Perkins was way more radical than Jeremy's program, probably because of the different period, 1980s compared with when Jeremy came to office in 2015. I mean, Jeremy, of course, didn't talk about closing down American bases, withdrawing from NATO and all of that. But there are other differences as well, because although you refer to the role of a parliamentary party at the end of the book, it doesn't occur at all at the start of Harry's tenure. And whereas Jeremy faced insurrection within months, I mean, how he stood that baying mob behind him on the bench, on his own benches, I'll never know. So it's that. But also he had a general secretary against him. He had the regional officers against him, and none of that, of course, applies. And he actually, you talk at some point, I think, about Harry had the NEC. Well, Jeremy was always in a very tenuous position with the NEC as well. So I think there are real differences. And of course, another difference is the period we're in, isn't it? Yes. 1980s, working class, 1982, before the miners' strike, strong, undefeated working class. Jeremy comes to office after 30 years of industrial defeat in a way. And he was almost beyond his, outside of his period. The tragedy for Jeremy, I think, was we had the most left-wing leadership in history of the Labour Party at a period when the working class was quite weak. But the advantage he had over Ben, it seems to me, Ben was only ever deputy, well, he lost the deputy leadership even, he didn't even, whereas Jeremy actually got to the leadership of the party. So, you know, there's fascinating differences. And I just wonder if you could do a bit of comparison between the two periods.
Well, Jeremy owed his meteoric rise to one single issue, Iraq. And it was an issue on which his judgment, and indeed some of his colleagues, proved superior to that of the sophisticated people who had been leaders of the party under previous administrations. He was a leading light in the Stop the War campaign, and the Stop the War campaign built up a considerable social media operation, which was put at his disposal when he wanted to run for leader, or when he did run for leader. I'm not sure he ever did want to run for leader, but when he did run for leader. And so that, I think, explains his rise. He was right about one of the big questions about which most Labour Party members were very concerned. But the problem I come back to is that he just didn't have the support, enough support in the parliamentary party. Now, there were many forces ranged against him. If you take the same ones that were ranged against Harry Perkins or Tony Benn even, the intelligence and security services didn't play a large part, I don't think, in sabotaging Jeremy's reign. But they are much more, I won't say they're accountable these days, but they are out in the open much more these days, and we know what they get up to. But Sir Richard Dearlove, a man who was head of MI6 at the time of the Iraq War, certainly was spectacularly wrong about weapons of mass destruction. He had retired by this time, and he several times went, including the day before the the day of the general election in 2017, was it? He went public saying that Corbyn mustn't be elected leader, he'd be a threat to the security of the nation. So that was the only significant contribution by anybody connected with the security services that I'm aware of. The media were Jeremy's biggest enemies, and by God, they certainly inflicted some damage. And also, as you rightly say, people in the parliamentary Labour Party, and in particular, people like Margaret Hodge. Once the anti-Semitism trope was up and running, some of Jeremy's fiercest critics were given the freedom of the airways virtually to say what they liked about him without really any comeback. And Margaret Hodge certainly was allowed to address the nation daily on the Today programme at times, without really being challenged, as she should have been.
But don't you think, Chris, that the reason the Secret Service didn't get that involved was that we hadn't got there yet? I mean, Harry Perkins was Prime Minister. If Jeremy had been Prime Minister, I reckon that would have got very involved indeed. And the second point, if you could just answer this point, the way you talk about, well, he couldn't have been successful because of the nature of the PLP, but the PLP wasn't a given. There was more than in Ben's time. We had a mass membership, 600,000. Looking at my figures, I think even under when Ben was struggling for deputy leader, it was most 320,000. There was a movement there, despite the weakness of the trade unions, that could have been mobilised with open selection, mandatory reselection, to have really attacked that. And unfortunately, I think it was a mistake. Jeremy and his comrades just didn't go along that road. I'm not saying it would have made the critical difference, but it could have contributed to it. So there are 2 points I'd like you to answer there.
Yes, well, in fact, I was and remain a strong supporter of mandatory reselection. I was New Labour ahead of my time. Safe seats for life is old Labour. A renewable contract every 4 or 5 years is New Labour. But that's, by and large, there are always scare stories in the press from MPs who consider themselves to be under threat from their constituencies, but constituency parties are quite loyal to their MP, even when they disagree politically with them, providing they're doing the basic job. So reselection only really has ever been used against the idle and the drunk and the feckless, and not, I can think of a couple of cases where ideology played a part. Frank Hooley from Sheffield, Hooley from Healy, certainly lost his seat for ideological reasons. And of course, I think Ken Livingstone deposed Reg Freeson in Brent, but they're the only 2 cases I can think of where there wasn't, where MPs were removed for ideological reasons. So, but there was much more of a problem for Jeremy than that. Jeremy's office, the left-wingers in Jeremy's office were all at each other's throats. I mean, it's been well documented elsewhere. I'm sure you're aware of it. His office was dysfunctional. And Jeremy personally, he's got many strengths, but one of his faults is he's not very decisive. I put it as generally as possible. Somebody who wrote a book about all this, rather well informed and not unsympathetic, said he was like the boy Jesus, just floating above the terrible arguments raising just beneath him. He would never get involved. I have some sympathy with that. Obviously, you don't want to get embroiled in all the minutiae. But his office was not functional. He had very little support in the Parliamentary Labour Party. The person whose head was really screwed on was John McDonnell. John McDonnell was serious about power, and he had a plan. John, I think, is a much tougher person than Jeremy. He lacks Jeremy's charisma, but my thought about John, though, is that under that, because he became sort of apparently terribly moderate and reasonable. He did many very good interviews in which he effortlessly batted back all that was thrown at him and had a smile on his face. You always felt that under that calm exterior, he was drawing up lists of those to be shot on day 1 of the revolution.
I wish I could believe that about John. I mean, my experience of John was him conceding on the anti-Semitism.
Yes. He also,
and really to a shameful degree. You know, when he intervened with the debate with Margaret Hodge, when she, basically called Jeremy an effing and she should have got disciplined for that. And John intervened and stop that happening.
Yes, well, you may be right about that. I mean, that anti-Semitism business, which I hope we won't get too bogged down on, is a dreadful toxic sludge, and you can never shake it off. The passions that it aroused and the falsehoods, frankly, that were propagated, and certainly major exaggerations. Yes, I think there was a problem. It was a very small one, and it was blown up out of all proportion. It was weaponized for political reasons.
Graham, any more you want to ask? Tina.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chris, for joining us. We're moving on to the second part of our show, and we're very welcome. I'm happy to welcome Michael Roberts, a Marxist economist who blogs under the name, or the website name, thenextrecession.wordpress.com. Welcome, Michael. We want to talk about some of the issues that actually Chris also just mentioned in terms of John McDonnell. We'll get to John McDonnell because he had an economic plan as well, didn't he? But first, let's talk about Liz Truss a little bit. I mean, that's almost over now, isn't it? Because Liz who? Exactly. In a couple of months' time, nobody will remember. We remember, though, because it was quite shocking that the role of the markets, as it was called, tumbling down, ruining for many, many people, their mortgage payments went through the roof, etc., etc. The economy crashed, etc. This is very interesting because her plan was obviously sort of in favor of capital. Quite a lot of individual capitalists were possibly quite in favor of much of a mini budget, for example, abolishing the 45% tax rate. It's rather nice for the individual capitalist. But capital, or the markets, as a collective, as an entity that's there, we're not in favor. Can you explain that problem there, the contradiction there?
Well, the real contradiction is what's in the interests of big business and finance in Britain, particularly finance, because Britain is very much a rentier economy. What I mean by that is that most of the profits come from interest and other measures which aren't related to actual productive investment anymore. Britain very much sucks profits from the rest of the world and acts as a conduit for huge amounts of capital flows in and out of the City of London. And that's its main activity. The manufacturing sector, as you know, has been reduced quite substantially over the last 30 years. So when the Truss government, if we can call it that, suggested that, first of all, they want to deregulate the economy, that they were going to go for growth, spend huge amounts of money, of government money, and not finance it, particularly through tax increases, in fact, quite the opposite, to cut taxes, then the question of a huge deficit between the revenues that governments are collecting and what they're going to spend arises. And the deficit has been estimated at something anywhere between, over a period of years, of the remainder of this current Conservative government's time, of anything between 65 and 100 billion pounds. How is that to be financed? Well, the only way that governments finance it, apart from going outright and just getting the Bank of England to print money for a period of time, is to issue bonds and get foreign investors and domestic investors, pension funds and others, to buy these bonds. But of course, that deficit and that size of debt means that a lot of people in the city and elsewhere are not going to buy those bonds at prices that the government wants. So the price of those bonds was likely to fall if they were to be issued. And that meant the inverse of that means that the interest on those bonds are going to have to be higher if people are going to be attracted to buying them. That's when I say people, I'm talking about the financial institutions, both foreign and domestic. So interest rates sharply rose, and the Bank of England was already in a position of difficulty because we have a very high level of inflation, as we know, hitting 10% a year. If you want to include mortgages, it's more like 13% a year, the inflation rate at the moment. So the Bank of England was already started a process of increasing interest rates as well, under the supposed policy of controlling inflation. And now it was posed with the issue of higher bond yields or bond interest rates rising, and that would force a very serious situation for companies and institutions. They would find the cost of borrowing would be dramatically increased, not just the cost of mortgages and household borrowing. That didn't interest the City of London very much. They were much more interested in the cost of borrowing to finance investment, to carry out their capital flows and other things. And that was going to be a very sharp rise in the premium, as they called, on the interest rates for bonds. The Financial Times called it the moron premium, introduced by the result of Truss's policies. And the City of London and big business could not stomach that particular solution, with no way of controlling this level of interest rates rising. The pound was collapsing as foreign investors pulled out. That would mean a sharp increase further in inflation, again making it more difficult for big business and the city to make any profits. They will be squeezed. In fact, just today, the Financial Times pointed out how sharply profits are being squeezed at the moment by rising costs and rising interest rates. So they had to do something about that. And that's when the Bank of England basically said, well, we're going to bail out the city with £65 billion worth of bailout towards pension funds in particular. And the whole media campaign then became launched against the Truss government to eventually bring it down. And today we have the result of that. We have the result that the representative of big business and finance in the Conservative cabinet is now our Prime Minister to get the hand of the King Charles tomorrow, Tuesday morning, to form a government. So in a period of just a few weeks, it's been possible for the city and big business to turn things around. A demonstration in the end that who runs this economy and who runs this country.
Yeah, it's not Tory members either. Some people complain that it's, you know, he hadn't been elected by the country, but it's clearly something else going on. So is Capital going to be happier with him then? Do you think his program is more to their liking?
Well, undoubtedly, immediately they're going to be much happier. Already those bond yields have come down and the moron premium has begun to disappear because no longer, in their view, the city, a moron is no longer Prime Minister. So now they're in a position to hope that Sunak will carry out a policy along with converted Chancellor Hunt, who was swinging around from wanting to cut taxes during the campaign in supporting Liz. He has now swung round to maintaining all the taxes before, and next Monday he's going to propose a whole range of new taxes in order to close this deficit that has developed as a result. So all the spending measures that the government had in mind have been drastically reduced. We know, for example, that the energy price cap, which is expensive indeed for government spending, has been cut back from a maximum of 2 years to just 6 months. So I point out to you, as householders, already with the price cap at 2,500 on average spending energy, that is more than a doubling of where we were just over a year ago. And after April, there is no cap anymore. And we could go, according to some estimates, to 4,500 average energy bill, average, some people pay more and some less, just in 6 months' time, with some possibility that the poorest or the most needy will get some support from the government. But that ending of that spending cap, and on the other hand, introducing probably a series of other tax measures, is where we're heading. We're heading back towards a fiscal austerity policy where the government of Sunak and Hunt will aim at balancing the books over the next few years, and then probably releasing some nice juicy tax cuts and measures just before an election in 2 years' time. No election is planned now. That's the policy that the Sunak Hunt government plans.
That's what I was going to ask you next. Unless the Tories want to press the self-destruct button, they're not going to call an election anytime soon, because especially with those price caps, as you mentioned, it coming up.
Well,
I think there's no chance.
I would say, Tina, if we look at the polls, it would be suicide if a generation was called now. Even if the polls are exaggerating, it's clear that Labour would win by a mile, maybe more, at the current moment. So obviously the new cabinet under Sunak doesn't want to do that, but it's not going to be easy. And I think this is the point that everybody should realise over the next 2 years. To use Bill Clinton's famous phrase, "Is the economy stupid?" And the economy is in a shambles. It's in a total mess. We are going into a significant recession or slump next year and probably into 2024. The worst in the G7, probably, so that we're going to see a rise in unemployment. We're going to see reductions severely in any possibility of expanding any decent services for people over the next couple of years. No wage increases are going to be allowed. All the strikes taking place, they'll be bitterly opposed by business and government. It's going to be an extremely difficult period. And there's a sizable section of the Conservative Party in the Parliamentary Party and in the Shires, because remember, the Tory party members are basically a bunch of crazies. They are petty bourgeois, county set people, or a very small layer of people disillusioned with Labour from working people. But the majority of the members are of these sorts of people who have no inclination towards even the interests of big business. Big business lost control of the Conservative Party over the last few years and replaced it with these Tea Party crazies led by the likes of Rees-Mogg and others in the European Research Group. So these people are going to oppose all of these measures. So it's not going to be easy for Sunak and Hunt to carry through this program of austerity over the next 2 years in the midst of an economic recession. And I don't see them even managing to win an election in 2 years, despite what they might hope.
So who is big business supporting that? Is it Starmer already, you think? Has he already
No, not yet. I think that I happen to know quite well amongst, as you may not know, or maybe you do, I still do a bit of work for a bunch of financial capitalists and hedge funds. And I can tell you in their little discussions, they think Starmer's a pretty good bloke. We can count on him to carry through the necessary policies to keep Britain in shape, or towards that effect. Although they're not so sure about some of the people behind him in the shadow cabinet. They find those people a bit iffy, but on the whole, they look to Starmer, but they don't need him at the moment. They have what they want. If that doesn't work out, then of course, an election in 2 years' time and Labour returned with a Starmer cabinet, I don't think it's going to be too much fear and worry from the majority of the city and big business. There's always a layer of people who think anything but Labour. But on the whole, I think at the moment, unless we see some different policies from the shadow cabinet and the leadership of the Labour Party at the moment, as far as I understand it, our position is, I say ours, the leader's position is, as far as I understand it, is that we want an energy price cap, but only 6 months, the same as Hunt has introduced. We want some probably more taxes on the rich and maybe on energy than the government wants at the moment. But we are apparently, according to Sakia, the party of sound money, which actually used to be the slogan very much of the Treasury and the Conservative Party in the past. So that's, I think, a comforting factor for the City of London.
John McDonnell tried a similar way to lure the economy or the economists. He kept saying that all his measures were fully funded, and here I've done all the calculations, etc. You know, quite different to what Liz Truss has done. I mean, she just blurted it out. What do you think that would have succeeded, you know, showing the city where the money is coming from to stop those kind of attacks that we've just seen on Liz Truss?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't see anything particularly wrong with costing your spending. I mean, that seems perfectly a reasonable thing to do, and people want to know how much it's going to cost, whatever it is. The real question is, how are you going to raise the funds to do what you want to do, and what sort of spending are you carrying out? Now, if the spending is, for example, on increasing military spending, as the government wants to do at the moment, if your spending is on providing more subsidies to energy companies, then maybe that's not the right sort of spending that we're looking to cost. If your spending is on introducing better public services, of improving the, providing the funding necessary for the decimated NHS and our schools. I mean, we only heard this week that Rishi Sunak policies when he was Chancellor was actually increased the funding to the richest schools and reduced it to the schools in the poorest areas. If that's the way you're going to operate spending, then it's not so much the cost, you know, well, that's relevant, but what you're spending it on. What frightened the City of London and big business from the McDonnell-Corbyn programme was not so much whether it was costed or not, because the media makes a fuss about that, but they know you can run a deficit as long as it's productive and produces more revenue through extra growth, which in a sense Liz Truss was correct, that if you can get more growth, then you get more revenue and you can pay for your spending. That's a perfectly reasonable policy. They know that as well. What frightened them was all the measures that were included in the manifesto, particularly the 2017 manifesto, of basically public ownership of the energy companies, of renationalising rail, and various other measures which were bound to be damaging to the profitability of the capitalists, in particular the city. That's what they're really opposed to. They'll use the argument that it's that Labour is a spendthrift. That argument's used 100 times. I think even Sunak said the reason we're in a mess now is because of Labour. So I've forgotten what happened. When was the last time the Labour government was in office? These sorts of arguments are stupid. The city knows what they are. What they're more worried about is actually implementing the programme that McDonnell and Corbyn had in mind.
Now, considering, I mean, if we presume Corbyn had actually been allowed to become prime minister, which is very questionable, seeing as the much of the parliamentary Labour Party would have gone to great lengths to stop voting for him. But imagine he had become a prime minister, and with McDonald's plan, would they have been able to, in your view, to stop like the run on sterling, the crashing of the markets? Did they have measures in place that would have stopped that? I'm asking, we need to plan for these kind of things, don't we, as socialists?
We certainly do. And to give the due to John McDonnell and his team, they did thought about this risk. We're talking about people who are good socialists in John McDonnell's team, and they were aware of that this was what was going to happen. We already, as Chris has already explained, the role of the Parliamentary Labour Party was truly disgusting, and it was basically the party MPs, or the majority of them, didn't support the programme of the leadership, didn't want to campaign for it, tried to break it, and if Corbyn and McDonnell had got into government, then they would obviously politically have opposed it. There's no guarantee that such a government would be able to carry a majority in Parliament as a result, because they would undoubtedly been split. But let's take hypothetically that they did have a majority and they could sustain that majority. What should they have done? Because the immediate thing would have been building up a run on the pound, an increase in bond yields, which you've just been talking about. There will be basically a strike of capital. How could we overcome that? Well, I think one of the things that McDonnell team did, they actually asked me to participate in a study to do that, was the first thing when you come into office, in my opinion, is to get control of the finance sector. The finance sector, you badly need that. And where do you start that? You start with the Bank of England. The Bank of England is supposedly independent of the government. It can make decisions about interest rates and all the other things without consulting the government. All it has to do is meet a target on inflation. That idea of independence of the central bank is so anti-democratic and so reduces the ability of a left government to act that it's not surprising that it was introduced by Blair and Brown in their period of office, and becomes a general thing to do in most of the major economies now. Central banks are independent of their governments. But where they are not independent, it's possible for governments to implement different policies. For example, I would have thought a Labour government now, if it came to power today, would take back control of the Bank of England and stop interest rates. We would not increase interest rates. We would reverse them if necessary in order to give some support to people and households and small companies. That can be done. What will that mean? Further run probably on the pound and on the bond yields. What do we do about that? Well, then the next step is the question of capital controls. What do we mean by capital controls? We mean that governments should, and with the help of the banks, and the Bank of England in particular, but also bank workers, we would stop the movement of capital flows, portfolio flows, currency flows, hot flows as they're called, out of the country by the rich, by companies and by financial institutions. We would block it. It would be illegal. They would not be allowed to take their money out of the country. It would have to stay here. This, of course, is against all international rules and would cause a mighty explosion further. But then that's the process that would inevitably go about. Could it work? Well, let me give you one example. In the Asian political crisis of 1998, most governments then in Asia went to the IMF and borrowed money in order to try and get through the crisis. Malaysia did not do that. Malaysia introduced capital controls. They didn't take IMF money. They just closed the financial borders and they stopped money going out. As a result, their currency held up, and also their economy eventually was restored. They didn't have to go through building up huge amounts of debt that other Asian economies had. Finally, Tina, on the third point is you can't stop at just the Bank of England. You've got to have control of the major financial institutions. So particularly in the UK, that means the big 5 banks, which will have the majority of our deposits, do most of the lending, will make most of the financial decisions, and the periphery of financial institutions around them. And without public ownership of the banks, putting them under control of the government in the interest of people, then we're going to be on a hiding to nothing. I just wanted to quote to you give you an example of the Paris Commune of 1871. When the Paris workers occupied and took over Paris and set up their own workers' councils, and the ruling class was driven back into Versailles, they had control politically of the capital of France. But the one thing they did not do was take control of the Banque de France. They left that out of their control. Engels writes in the Civil War, for example, many things were neglected that the Commune should have done. The most difficult is the holy respect which the Commune stopped in front of the doors of the Banque de France. It was, moreover, a serious political mistake. The bank in the hands of the Commune was worth more than 10,000 hostages. Commune exhausted to hostages of the ruling class to try and bargain. If they had control of the funds of the Banque de France, they would have been able to really expand their plan and also stop. You know what happened? The Banque de France sent 95% of all its money to Versailles to help the forces of a counter-revolution and gave a few dribbles to the Paris Commune. Lenin once said, he said, the banks we know are the centers of modern economic life, the principal nerve centers of the whole capitalist economic system. To talk about controlling economic life, that's controlling it for us, and yet evade the question of the nationalizations of banks means either betraying the most profound ignorance or deceiving the common people by florid words and promises with the deliberate intention of not fulfilling those promises. And so unless we control the banks and bring them into public ownership, then we can't carry out some of these other policies of capital controls, of regaining control of the currency and of the other financial flows that exist in the economy. That's number one that has to take place. But of course, if you did that in the first 2 to 3 weeks of a Labour government, you can imagine the reaction that will come from the city and big business, not just in this country, but internationally. And the things that Chris has talked about, that he wrote in the semi-fictional book, is exactly what would then start to take place in the minds of the ruling class. But that's, I'm afraid that anybody who thinks out there that we can introduce a socialist change in our society that will dramatically and irreversibly improve the lot of working people, and it will just go peacefully through an act of parliament as a result of a majority Labour government, is not looking at history properly.
Absolutely. Fascinating insights there, especially of the Paris Commune. That's very interesting. Now, in terms of, what you outlined, what needed to be done, and I understand that you put that forward to John McDonnell, I presume. How did they react to it, and how much of it did they take on board?
Well, on capital controls, actually, they suggested to me that I might do a study on capital controls. Some of their team, who are now holding jobs elsewhere, but so I'm sure that was part. I mean, it's not such a radical measure, capital controls. It's a basic protective measure for a government that faces a run on the banks and on its currency organized by international capital. And of course, it wouldn't be enough, but it would be something that would control the flow of funds, give time for a government to build an alternative policy, which would then had to include control of the central bank, the Bank of England, and the major banks and financial institutions. And you can't control them, by the way, without the support of the workers working in them. And the proof of that has been in many historical accounts. It's one thing to say, the Bank of England is under our control, but if all the Bank of England officials are doing everything in their power to operate against the government's policies, then it's not going to work. So it means a transformation of the workforce as well. Possibly at the top end, it means the removal of some people and the replacement of them by people from the bottom end. But that's a process, again, which requires preparation and to be built. I mean, it's not going to come overnight. So capital controls is one measure, control of the financial institutions another. But then we have to go further, of course, down the road. If a Labour government's still surviving and hasn't been removed by a military coup, that you then move on to the question of trying to develop a plan that's in the interests of working people by controlling the productive forces. I'm finished on this particular point. When we say that we want to cost our spending, we also have to recognize that the majority of productive spending is not done by a government, at least not in a capitalist economy. Government investment, that's not spending on civil servants and public services. That's government investment in infrastructure and other things like that is just 3% of GDP. British in business investment is 15% of GDP. So it's 5 times larger. So what big business does with its 15% is way, way more important than what governments do with their 3%. We need the ratio the other way round. And the only way that ratio will be the other way around is bringing into common and democratic ownership the strategic sectors of the economy to enable a plan to be aimed at investment and employment that's in the interest of working people. We can save money. Why are we spending or going to spend 3% of GDP on military spending? Why are we spending 1% of GDP on subsidies for the energy companies so that they can go on producing fossil fuels? There are a whole range of savings that a working class Labour government could do, which would help to increase revenues and
Oh, what a shame.
Let's hope he's coming back and notices that he's frozen.
I mean, it's a fascinating conversation. I mean, that's part of the problem. His mouth is still open and I'm waiting for him to finish the sentence, because I was actually going to ask him something that I heard on the radio this morning, which has been troubling me for the last few days. And it's about the kind of Truss coup. And somebody was saying that the thing about the Truss economics is that what that was preparing for was to take advantage of this sort of freedom from the EU. It's from Brexit. And now what we've got is actually the worst of all worlds, because we have with Sunak those same kind of economic policies that are going to go through, which is going to be battening down on public spending and you know, all the rest of it. And yet not having any of the benefits of Brexit. So I really wanted as well to discuss how this is going to work if there was a Starmer government. You know, what is the difference there in terms of Starmer? Oh, he's back.
I don't know what happened then. I blame you.
Let's blame Jackie. Yes, why not? Jackie, do you want to repeat that quickly?
Okay, I'm really interested in something I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I heard on the radio this morning, which was the issue about what's happened with Truss and the fact that her economic policy was kind of suited to this vision of Brexit, which they have been carrying, this far-right group within the Tory party. And that was to take advantage of the freedom from the kind of EU rules. And so now what we're going to have in a way is the worst of both worlds. We're not going to have the advantages of Brexit, but neither are we going to in any way follow through with the philosophy that got us to Brexit. And it strikes me that that is also what we're going to get with Starmer, because he seems to be, you know, supporting that level of military spending. He seems to be supporting austerity. So, you know, I'm presuming what's going to happen is that when Starmer does this, if and when Starmer gets into power and he does this, we are going to see the continuing economic decline. We've just had, 12 years of austerity. What are we going to have? Another 12 years, another 20 years of austerity? And at what point will actually, if you like, the forces of the working class, I'm going to use very old-fashioned language here, be able to kind of break through this and say, this isn't working?
Well, I don't know whether I entirely agree that Brexit was good news. It certainly wasn't good news for the British economy.
Yeah.
And British capitalism, the finance sector found it as a disaster. Big businesses finding a disaster, and small businesses in particular finding it extremely difficult. This is, if you look at the data, you can see there's been a sharp gap opening up between the rest of the G7 economies and some of the Eurozone economies, even though they're not doing very well, and the UK. The UK is doing by far the worst amongst the G7 economies. It's was called last week by the economist the new Italy, as though Italy was always been the sick man that could never get any act together with growth rate that was below 1% a year. I can tell you now that most official estimates, and I don't think they're being unreasonable, are suggesting that the UK will hardly grow at all between now and the general election in 2024. In fact, quite the reverse, it will be negative. And beyond that, I see no prospect unless there's a dramatic change, as you say, that can allow it to grow any faster than that. I mean, I had in the papers today that China's slowing down. Well, and China's in a mess. It's only growing at 3.9% according to the latest figures. Well, I can tell you any G7 economy that could claim 3.9% year on year would be in raptures, including Biden. In the case of all these countries, the G7, Germany, France, the UK, US, Canada, they're all going into a recession. And Brexit or not, when I last discussed Brexit back in 2016 and 2019, I said Brexit, I think, is bad news for the British economy, but it's nothing compared to a slump. It's a tiny slow burn in its impact compared to the slumps that capitalism breeds on a regular basis. The last one was 2008-9. Then we had the 2020 pandemic slump. And here we are, nearly more than 3 years away, and we're going into another one. In other words, it's really a recurrence of the one that would have happened if there hadn't been a pandemic slump anyway. So I don't think there's any prospect of improvement, whatever policy is adopted by either those who think that the policy of deregulation, which is what Truss and the other gang thought, and opening up to free zones where there's no tax, there's no regulations, employees have no rights. These zones are going to be opened up, which Sunak, by the way, also supports across Britain, to make Britain the best place in which you can carry out the exploitation of people in the whole world, which it boils down to. That was the Truss policy, and it still has elements of that in the Sunak government as well. That policy wouldn't work anyway. It won't work because the development of investment productively, the profitability of British capital is so weak, and their ability to compete on the world markets is deteriorating sharply, that even that is not going to work.
Michael, a few people also in the chat here of this meeting are pushing forward the idea for that modern monetary theory might be a way to deal with the crisis. Perhaps, I believe they think it is some kind of alternative perhaps to the measures as a socialist transformation would require, which are quite radical. As you said, we also have to start talking about taking away the means of production from the capitalists and running them by ourselves. These are important, radical measures that would have to be taken in a socialist transformation. Is MMT an alternative for you, in your view? Would that work?
Well, the merits of the modern monetary theory is to tell us that we don't have to balance the books at government level. It's not like a household, although no household I know balances the books, they're always borrowing. But governments can borrow with the prospect of trying to grow the economy by using the extra spending that they've created by borrowing to invest and develop the economy, and that will inevitably bring to the position where they can growth can be sustained by a basis of having a bit of a government deficit. Make 2 points on that. There's nothing particularly wrong with that. The difference between it's a Keynesian policy, which has been around since Keynes was around and before the Second World War. The difference with modern monetary theory is that they say you don't need to issue bonds to do that. So you don't have to be beholden to the City of London and their willingness to purchase your bonds. You can just get the central bank to print money. When I use the word print, I used to get attacked by the MMT because nobody prints money anymore. Let me rephrase that and say the central bank can place a load of money into the commercial banks, increase their reserves by just adding to their reserves. And then they hopefully will then spend that into the economy. All I would say is, and it applies whether you want to borrow bonds, whether you want to run a deficit, whether you want to print money, if you don't use the money productively to produce better investment, employment and growth, then it's only going to open up to the possibilities of increased inflation and a move out of the currency in your particular country. And that's the danger of just relying on deficit spending and the printing of money as an alternative. Can we get productive investment? That doesn't depend upon how you're raising the funds. It depends on where you're putting it and how much you're putting it. And I repeat, big business controls the investment of our economy, not the government. The government doesn't have a sufficient control over that. So if the government is printing money to try and spend more, if it cannot alter the general forces of growth in production, all that will happen is it will get more inflation and there will be a run on the pound at a certain point. MMT people agree that the constraint is that, and that the constraint is that you get inflation unless there's growth. Exactly. And that's exactly what the Truss government showed by just issuing a plan for more spending without actually having any policy for covering those costs, or that it was going to produce anything that would actually take the economy forward. And so they faced a run on the pound and an increase in bond yields as a result. And I have to say that in that case, MMT is not an alternative. It's not an alternative to a socialist plan. If it's seen as an alternative, that's a danger. That's a risk. That's, in my view, that will be leading us down the wrong path. I think all we have to do is print money and run a deficit, and the government spends and everything will be fine. No, it won't, not under capitalism.
It also doesn't touch who's controlling production, who's controlling.
In my view, that's key. I mean, maybe MMT people might say, oh, yes, we're socialists too. We want to do that as well. Well, in that case, what is MMT offering us as extra from the program of a socialist transformation of the economy? Is my reply to MMT is when they say that. Yes, we're socialists. Actually, the large number of MMTs are not even socialists. American MMT is not socialist at all. They don't want to transform the economy into socialism. They think they can make capitalism work better with MMT.
So would it work as a, you have a revolution somewhere like Russia, for example, which was the only country that managed to do it at the time, and it struggled to survive. Yeah. Would MMT work in a country like that to help it, exist a bit longer?
Clearly doesn't seem to work very well where people have tried it on their own, where they just, governments just expand their money. I mean, a classic example, you might say, I'm not saying it wasn't a revolutionary campaign, but Mr. Mugabe certainly just printed enough money and turned inflation into 2,000% a year. If you want to put a more fair example, Venezuela is forced into the position of having to print money because it had no alternative, it didn't have any dollars. And of course, it created an inflationary situation. But then that's an issue. If you have a transformation by a socialist government, comes to power, wins, has a parliamentary majority, avoids all the political, military dangers that exist, survives, and tries to plan for the economy, it's on its own. Well, is it on its own? That's the key question. If it remains on its own, then it's not going to succeed against the forces of capital led by US imperialism. That's why you cannot stop on our national borders. We may start on our national borders, but we have to go beyond our national borders. We have to appeal to working people in Europe and labour movements in Europe and elsewhere to support a socialist government if that's what the UK has got, and to get your own. After all, that's what should have been done in the case of Greece, when the Greek government came to power with a program of radical change and faced the threat of complete financial cut-off by the IMF and the European Troika. But they did not do that. They did not do that effectively enough to win the support of working people against their own governments. And those are governments then combined to crush the Greek government.
Yeah, absolutely. Internationalism is hugely important, as the Russians noticed after, the Germans didn't make revolution, didn't succeed. Graham, you've got a question.
Yeah, brilliant, Michael, as was Chris. I just want to carry on where you talked about the international dimension of all this. And so you've said we're in this wonderful situation where we've got this socialist government, never mind whether it's Harry Perkins or Jeremy Corbyn, doing its capital controls, nationalisation of the banks, of the commanding heights of the economy. Still, I still don't fully understand how that protects us, assuming it's us, against a run on sterling. And if it doesn't protect us, how long can we really last out? Because obviously we both come from a similar tradition. Socialism in one country ultimately ain't going to happen. But obviously you've got to start somewhere. So what can we do assuming that the international proletarian revolution doesn't happen in all the advanced countries on the 1st of October on the same day? It ain't going to happen that way either. So what can we do in the interim period, trying to spread socialism throughout the world, revolution, whatever, how do we how do we protect ourselves, and how can we avoid this this run on sterling, given the global kind of surround that we would be facing?
Well, time always comes into things, Graham. Nothing's immediate. The very first period of a Labour government with such a policy and aim must be to get control of the financial sector. I go back to that. You can't immediately do all these other things. And so that means, as I say, capital controls, we need to end the flow of funds. That stops in the tracks the ability of foreign investors in particular, and domestic rich people and companies to take their money out of the country, because that's what drives the currency down. If there's not funds there to back the currency, if we have control of the commercial banking and the Bank of England system to back the currency, we can use the reserves that we've got, which are quite considerable in the UK. And we can also issue bonds. The government, Labour government, can issue bonds, the solidarity bonds, if you like, to get support from the people to finance the government so that it can provide the support, get the spending power that it needs to carry out various things immediately to improve the conditions of people from day one. Lots of things we can do from day one to improve the conditions of working people. That wins support. The more support you get, it boils down to political support. It's not just down to the question of whether the currency is under threat. We can't do anything about it, so we just have to accept that finance is a control. No, we have to fight that with the support of the people. We must block the ability of finance to operate against us, against the government and against the institutions and the currencies and the resources that we have. And we need to increase the resources through the support of the people. It's a process over time. Whether that would succeed and how long it would succeed is impossible to say in advance. All I would say is that I think Britain, a country of quite considerable wealth compared to the majority of the world, considerable resources, a high level of educated population, so quite a lot of a good means of production that are effective with a great deal of skills. It's a much stronger position than Greece is against Europe, or even Russia was in 1917, or China was in 1949. If we had a socialist government in Britain, do you think the rest of the labour movement around the world, particularly in Europe, would sit there? Well, that's very interesting. I'm not interested in that. I don't think that. We have to recognise a complete political transformation that would take place in the minds of people around Europe. And the idea that governments of Europe, right-wing governments of Europe, would then tend to strangle a socialist government in Britain would produce a big movement across Europe, in my view, particularly if our socialist government was acting in that direction. There is time. It's not going, yes, it could all go down the drain, but there is a lot of time, a lot more time than Greece had, a lot more time than Russia had, in order to transform it without being forced backwards to where we were before.
I think it also depends on which country, which working class is making that leap first, perhaps. I mean, if it's somewhere, Zimbabwe, that's not going to spark the rest of the revolution. If it's Germany, Britain, France, America in particular, I mean, that could change things quite dramatically, and you don't need it, all
just think of it, Tina. If the US had a socialist government, it's on its own. Well, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, if a socialist government came to power in the US, what do you think would happen in Europe, in Canada, in the rest of the world? I mean, that would be the end of imperialism. That would be the end of it. There would be no coming back for imperialism if the US became socialist. But of course, that's not our position. Our position is we could have a socialist government, of course, who knows, but we would still face the forces of US imperialism and their allies.
So that would be a key ally to win the working class in the US to make revolution once again. I mean, they have done it before. It's not like they're totally lost. It's a revolutionary country, isn't it? Let me just ask you, maybe perhaps finally, about the state of play when it comes to capitalism, because what's playing out currently with the drive to war, not just in Ukraine, that is I think a precursor to something different, perhaps. China, a big confrontation between China and the US is, being ramped up. You can follow it in the papers, etc. And we know it's sort of coming. The decline of capitalism, and we've seen it for the last few decades. It's going from one recession quicker into the next, into the next, into the next. Do you see a sort of, final death? Tragedy of capitalism developing? I mean, Marx said, the working class is needed as a grave digger of capitalism. But how well is capitalism still doing, and how what's the prospect looking for that system?
Well, capitalism is not doing very well at all. The 21st century the last 20 years have been pretty bad for the development of the productive forces under the capitalist mode of production. It's been terrible. Growth has slowed down, productivity has slowed down, investment growth has slowed down. Yes, people, at least in the major advanced capitalist economies, appear to have employment of some sort, part-time, temporary, whatever it is, with low wages. The vast majority of the global south, as we like to call it now, to encompass the rest, are in a shocking state, with facing serious problems on poverty levels, which are increasing again, and on levels of debt they have to pay the imperialist countries. The situation is awful, but there is no permanent crisis, as a number of Marxists have pointed out. Capitalism always finds a way to stagger on unless there's a transformation of the mode of production away from capitalism into something else, where the working class are in control of the levers of economic and political power. Until that happens, capitalism will stagger on. And I suppose you could even imagine, and it's a ghastly thought, but you could imagine that if capitalism is in a serious desperate position, we could likely get regimes that come to power that are prepared to take action against the working class in a physical and military manner, fascist regimes, which could lead to the end of a barbaric situation across the world. Of course, that we've seen that in world wars, and that's the danger that lies ahead. In the case of China, I think viewers should be aware that this is the most serious geopolitical situation for the 21st century. The US is now dedicated to strangling, containing, and reducing China's economic and political influence across the world and at home, and to remove its regime if it can. And it's prepared to spend money to do that. Spending money in Ukraine, it'll spend way more in trying to crush China's growth, which threatens the position of US imperialism as the leading economic force in the world. And it's planning that. It's preparing for using Taiwan as the, if you like, the anti-Semitism weapon of geopolitics to say we must defend Taiwanese democracy, and that means we're going to take on China militarily. The head of the US Navy only last week said, China is our main enemy and we must prepare for a war now in the next year. Now, obviously, that was probably designed to get more money for the US Navy out of the military spending budget. But having said that, that's an indication of the way the US military and the strategic forces in the US ruling class are thinking. This is going to be the issue of the next decade, if not earlier.
Absolutely, and it's very important that we look at that in more details, and I think we're planning to do that on Redline TV, and I think you've just talked to yourself into another gig to take a proper look at that. Graham, Jackie, any final questions?
Can I just say I thought that was absolutely brilliant, Michael, so I really appreciate it.
Well, I think I deserve a glass of wine now. Shall I have that after you've gone? Nice.
Or two. Jackie, do you want to say anything?
And thanks, everybody. I'm trying to pick up all the questions and points that people are making in the chat. I saw one or two I'd like to have said something about, but obviously there's not time.
No, if you want to pick up something, we've got an hour.
Well, I don't know if there's anything in the chat. Have you got much time? Have you? I don't know.
Have you read anything that you want to?
Well, just having a look. There's quite a few. Let me just say on MMT. I don't want to get into a big discussion about that, but one chat person says, well, MMT is just describing the way the banking system works. Well, there's some truth in that, but if that's all it's doing, then it's not helping us a great deal. But I think it's more than that. It aims as a policy. There are policies that come out of MMT, which I've just described about their merits and demerits. So it's not just that it explains how banks work. And I don't think that that's sufficient to make it an alternative to a socialist plan for the economy.
No, absolutely. So we do have another meeting next week. This is the Hear You Say, Have Your Say program on this issue. So I mean, Michael, if you're free next Monday, come along and we'll have some people who will speak in favor of MMT, no doubt. But we don't have time in this session tonight. But thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Chris. I thought that was a very interesting, and fascinating session. It shows that, you know, the path to socialism, well, socialism sounds like an easy idea, but actually it is bloody hard work, and we better be prepared and know what we're doing. And I think some people just think it's sort of things emerge out of the struggle, etc. And there's of course a truth to that, but we also have to be very clear on kind of the measures that will need to be taken, and that's a general rule, capital control, etc. That was very interesting. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, comrades, for listening in. Hopefully we see you next week at the Have Your Say, and we could have a discussion on MMT versus socialism. Perhaps that's a bit cheeky to put it like that, I'm sure. But thank you very much, comrades. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.